I think I grew up kind of like a cornstalk, you know, out of Nebraska soil. And I'm sure that has had a great deal of influence on my writing. And as I say, I was an only child, kind of isolated, much more than I think most children are now. Certainly they're not isolated in the cities. But we lived, I would say, a mile from the nearest children that were anywhere close to my age. We would get together a few times during the summer and, you know, have an afternoon of playing together, but it was not certainly not even a weekly occurrence. One thing I remember my mother saying is that she wanted me to learn to be able to entertain myself. And and I would say that if she ever taught me anything well, that she did do that well, because I'm a person that's hardly ever bored. I always have more things to do than I can fit in, and I think that does probably come from being an only child and loving to read and learning to write and try to express myself. Another thing that occurred to me, we did not have relatives in the area. The aunts and uncles and cousins all lived far away, and we wrote letters, and I think that's important. And I think that may have been a start for me. I think that letter writing has a lot of merit yet, and I still write a lot of letters. I have a number of friends that live far away, and we seem to write more than we talk on the telephone, which probably isn't the case with a lot of people. But some of us write lengthy letters to each other. You have to have a partner that's going to do the same thing. But it's also a good way of expressing yourself and your real thoughts. It's nice to receive a letter like that from the other person, too, and you can go back and reread it. And I think that it has a lot of value. And even though it's not poetry, it's another form of writing, actually. I was thinking about my grandmother a while back and what she would think of me and my poetry writing. And then I got to thinking that she did so many ordinary things with so much care and love and skill that perhaps those were her poems. So I wrote Grandmother's Poems. She made them out of common things, everyday tasks turned profound, the proud way she performed them, gathering kindling, knotting bundles of twigs for the wood box ready for burning. Later, her pies warm and brown from the oven, butterscotch, mincemeat, and lemon, but especially butterscotch, as sweet and as pure as a classic slipping over the tongue. Growing things, too, each bush or vine another stanza, raspberries, gooseberries, cucumbers, pansies scrolling down the path, moonflowers blooming at night like miniature ponies grazing quiet and grand at her doorstep. But her strongest were onions, fresh from the garden, Bermudas or sweet yellow Spanish sliced across contours of crisp growing cells and placed between slices of bread for a quick breakfast sandwich. Sometimes she ate them like apples, smacking her lips on the juice, electric as lightning, igniting her mouth. Have you ever looked off across the country at a hillside filled with trees and wondered how many trees maybe there were up there? I did that, and I wrote Counting Trees. Trees hold traces of color, even in winter, some ashen or reddish, others green, dull as old quilts, and their numbers run out of control over hills pushing out of the river. You count them in groups, starting with black ones like sheep, lumped in affectionate disarray by some dream-eyed shepherd boy. Then the shy, dove-colored limbs, almost white, lining the river, and all the stiff paintbrushes brushing the sky, till the numbers come looking like twigs multiplied over and over, branches times boughs times dry limbs times fingers, ending in nothing but echoes, numbers stumbling over loose stumps or erupting like crows, your count lost in the spray of their flight or in lights lacing the trees by the highway, where everything still is orderly, real people with missions aiming headlights straight over the river. And you counting trees as if that is why you were born, and the trees trying hard to be counted so none will be lost. How to untangle deciduous antlers with dusk coming on, and new trees climbing out of the river uncounted, and a disorder of crows taking your numbers cracked and half-eaten, mistaken for corn. Tonight I can hear it. When will the land sing along with the coyote, or run on the coyote's long legs? Living alone, can it turn wild and leggy, lope across its own hills, breath pulsing, pushing like wind through the sage? Is it agile enough to crawl into a lair, turn 3 times like a dog coyote, lick the loam from its paws and sleep away winter? Can the land go mad from the singe of the sun on its rough sand hide, from the pulling and swaying of canyons hanging limp as loose skin from its backbone? Tonight I can hear it, sending thin, hungry sounds to the sky, calling down thunder and whip-crack of lightning. And we did hear that tonight. This is to an American buffalo that I saw out at Pioneer Park. Only by tremble of nostril can I see you are real and not rock, rolled red-brown out of the mountains back of the fence. I watch, and somehow the wild in both of us wants out, wants to run with the herd your great-great-great-grandfathers ran with. Wants the earth pounding metrical monotones under us, dust clouding behind, always the dust and the flies, always the wild wanting free. You and me, still snorting, stampeding, still wagging our shag beards. This one I wrote about writing poems, at least how I write some poems, called just poems. Sometimes, like a stray pup from nowhere, one comes to me yipping, as if to be fed or to be written down, wanting every word stroked until it lies smooth like fine, well-kept fur, falls asleep seemingly whole in my lap, only to wake me later howling that something in its soul is amiss, wanting it rectified right away. Others tease for a long time, from a distance like fox kits, too wild and too shifty, though I coax and cajole each day, wanting to tame and control them like puppies. At night I see them playing in a far field, clear under cut-glass stars. I stay awake, building whole kennels of words to contain them. By morning, if I am lucky, one will come in. I grew up on a farm near Albion, Nebraska. I was an only child. I spent a lot of time by myself reading. I loved the outdoors. So I'd take a book and my dog and I'd go down in the trees and I'd read. And I don't think that I ever really wrote until there was an assignment in school to write a poem. And I think I was about 10 or 11, and my mother was sick. She wasn't even home. And I came home crying because I had to write this poem. And my dad sat down and helped me write it that night. And I don't know that that was my inspiration to begin writing, but I guess it was opened the door to it. And so I know that I wrote poetry and stories, probably from that time on and through high school. I did become very discouraged later because nothing ever was published and the rejection letters bothered me. And my circle of friends at that time, and even my family, did not seem to be very impressed with anything I wrote, and so I thought it was just no good. And so I stopped writing, and I was never going to pick up a pen and set it to paper again. And for quite a while I didn't, for probably 15 years. And then I saw another Nebraska writer's book, and I was so impressed with it, and in fact it was Susan Deal's first book. And somehow her poetry set me on fire, and I wanted to try to write again myself. So it's been since that time, which was probably about 1980, right in that time, that I have been writing quite steadily. I write mostly free verse, and it's what I prefer by far over the forms. I think that rhyming is too restrictive for me to express myself, because without being limited to rhyme, you can say a lot more. And it does not bother me that it doesn't rhyme. Now, I'll admit I had to get used to that at one point. My father was interested in poetry, and he didn't write, but he thought everything should rhyme. And I grew up under that influence, and it seems strange now, but there was a while that I actually kind of studied on my own, would study contemporary poetry that I would see in the papers and the magazines, and I think, well, now, why is that poetry, and what makes it poetry? Well, here I am. I have finally come through, and I'm writing it myself. I try real hard to put my poetry in a new form, that is, in new words, and not a cliche. I like to use a lot of imagery. My goal is to try to say it in a way that's never been said. It's kind of a high goal that I don't always meet. I know the solid gray lead of your branches is really the stopped flow of crystal, smarting in ice-swept wind. I know it's a mockery, this scornful portrayal of gray, these death-wretched fingers clawing all day at the sky, like hundreds of dry-picked bones, when inside you're alive like that possum, turned belly up by the road, quieting even its heart so as not to show life under dance of gray fur in the wind. And I know once the predator goes, life will flourish inside your gray carpels again, pulsing a triumph of urgent new green. I grew up on a farm in the era of the country schools, one-room country schools, and we lived 2 miles from school. And most of the time I walked, which I think was a good experience and a good start in my life. But there was one pitfall, and those were the ugly, brown, long cotton stockings I had to wear all winter to keep my little legs warm. And it was one thing wearing them in the winter, but then when spring came, my mother wouldn't let me give them up either. And there was not much you could do except this. And I called this Mother Doesn't Know. Green are the grasses in springtime, sprouting just one here and there, as if testing the air that Mother says still is too cold for wearing short socks to school, even though you have begged. But you know, as you walk through the pasture and see the bright blades shining out of the ground, that it's not. So, out of sight of the house, you roll down those cumbersome, bothersome socks, long and brown as winter's dull pasture, homely and hated as cornflakes turned mush in the bowl. You feel the crisp air, or the crisp day, trickling up your bare legs as you sprint with new zest through the field, to the road where you see that your girlfriends have done the same thing. All day, those rolled-down socks ride clumsy as cinnamon rolls on your ankles. All day you are heady with bite of fresh air and sun on your skin where you know they belong. But before you turn the last corner towards home, you remember to stop and roll them back up. Mother doesn't know it's spring. I studied a portrait I found of my great-grandmother Dorf, whose name was Johanna Dorf. This portrait was taken in Sweden, probably shortly before she immigrated to America. So I wrote Portrait of Johanna. Demurely done in grays and blacks, this portrait draws a charcoal likeness of Johanna. A face a carpenter could make with square and saw, yet molded soft by faith and fear to form a gracious personage, whose dark dot eyes reflect a past unknown to me and pierce a future yet unknown to her. Hair center parted, drawn back neatly to a bun beneath proud silk babushka. Hands large and discontent, stopped from their work, a wedding band, a simple dress, and decent straight-line smile. These shadow in the likeness of Johanna. someone I never met and never loved, and yet the very spark of life I breathe, I owe to this Johanna. Then I'd like to read Grandad's Jug, which was published in Kansas Quarterly earlier this year. Grandad's Jug. It would have got back at me somehow in some curse or untimely affliction if I'd let it go that day they came and wanted it, seeing it slouched far back in the cellar, alone but for a few old canning jars idling around it, decorated with dust and the dim tracks of spiders. It would have got back at me if I'd done it, I knew, seeing the stern brown glow that was Grandad's, living again bright under the dust, and the print of his whiskers rough on its side. At my touch, a spray of dried sweat flaked off to the floor, coarse from the scorch of the hayfield, and inside, the clear jounce of water, cold from the well, as if still wrapped up in the old burlap bag, stowed under a mound of green, sweaty alfalfa to hold the heat away. It would have got back at me all right, perhaps in the sharp choke of the hooch that he took sometimes when he needed it, or in the stout mix of tonic he dosed his horses with, tilting their long-drawn heads straight up toward the sky, as if for the moon to empty its nitrate down their long, bulky throats. In time, it would have come back to obsess me, broken and empty, poor as an old lost dog, its brown eyes dull and accusing. It can be something like a sunset or something beautiful in nature. That's probably the primary thing that inspires me to write. Also, it can be, I can be inspired by a happening or an experience. I began by writing mostly nature, poetry, and country poetry. That's probably my first love. But now I write about a lot of things, just about experiences. It's fun to write about people and describe people sometimes. It's fun to record stories in poetry form so that you have a way of remembering almost something interesting that happened in your life. The title poem of my book, Windmills Walk the Night, I guess that came about because my mother and I would drive through the country, and it seemed to me that as you drive and you see a windmill off here, as you drive this way, it's going off that way, and I could imagine it walking. And we would tease each other and say, there goes a windmill walking, and she'd say, no, it's running, that the wheel was running in the wind. And she could never understand how the windmill would be walking, but to me it is, and I could see, it has the tall steel stilts, which I mention in my poem. I have a book out called Windmills Walk the Night, and I'd like to read a few of the poems from that. And a lot of these were published in various journals or various publications of some kind. The title poem was published in Cappers, Windmills Walk the Night. Windmills walk the night on tall steel stilts. I've seen them walk in twos and threes, and sometimes only one walks lonely on a hill. I know a windmill wading hip-deep grass, its narrow shoulders hunched beneath the silver-petaled wheel that strums a metal music striking steel on steel. Sometimes it folds its flat-finned tail against itself and sleeps all day, a lonesome prairie bird on sturdy, ironclad feet. At other times it turns its tail into the wind, and there, with snorts and pirouettes it spins, a wild young horse on fettered wings. I like the silhouettes of windmills walking just at dusk in solitude, each set of metal vertebra a ladder to the clean, cool skies. Sometimes at night I listen for the reassuring clank of metal couplings tripping slow and rhythmic down the rusty iron pipe throat, to seek the place where water, flavored faint with earth and iron, flows cold. And I sleep on, serene in knowing that the windmill walks the night and measures time and peace on steel-strung rods, on clean, cool skies and stars. This is another about trees, a little short one. I like trees, so I like to write about them. Trees come to the river. Trees come to the river to drink. Every night the land listens for shapes of their long, slender legs, slicing the silence. The moon shadows them blacker, bolder than daylight, comely as a row of giraffes, sipping silverness out of the river, not one on its knees. That had been published in Plain Songs, which is a poetry journal published in Hastings, at Hastings College. Waiting Out the Wind. This also was published in Plain Songs and was named an award poem in their magazine back in 1988. Waiting Out the Wind. Always the summer storms in Nebraska, burgeoning black over the southwest hill, and your mother waking you, running in dark and in rain, carrying coats to the cave, in a panic of lightning that swallows the world down a thunderous throat, and your father watching grim from the top step, wind wrenching the door from his hands before he will close it to join you in a huddle around the sick flashlight. With gray sleep still warming your eyes, you crouch beside shelves, holding dim jars of pickles and choke cherry jelly. And you study the patterns of hewn earth, its cracks and its shadows, while there in the night, raw dirt rank in your nostrils, you wait out the wind. Always the scare of the wind in Nebraska, driving straws into tree trunks, grinding whole houses to slivers. You have to get under the ground to survive, inside the black pit of earth, and there, as if in a grave waiting judgment, for an hour you wait out the wind. Always the threat of the wind in Nebraska. Even now with no basement, the siren a blast, you prepare the hall closet with blankets and books. And pulling your puppy in with you, wait for the ominous sound of a train. Instead, on the door is a knocking, and a neighbor offers his basement for refuge. Once again, you run for your life, through panic of dark and of rain, the sky writhing fluid with lightning, thunder bolting and biting, as you gather with others inside the deep solace of earth to wait out the wind. This is a little more lighthearted, I guess, called Horseradish Heritage. Every good farm had a clump of the stuff, holding its glossy leaves upright in the same proud posture that skunks air their tails. Planted by some practical pioneer grandmother, who relished its bite on her tongue, knowing it would outlive her, would take with it her love to the tongues of her grandchildren, great-grandchildren, furnishing always one luxury, one day every year they could cherish, just when fall began sharpening itself on sumac and willow. A day set aside for digging a few of the white spicy roots from the loam she herself had patted around them. Then, tightening the grinder teeth onto the edge of an old table they'd carried out into the yard, the family with backs to the wind, taking turns turning the handle, grinding the pungent raw delicacy, wiping their eyes overcome by the vapors, exclaiming how juicy this year and how tender. Then at mealtime, mixed with a bit of sugar and vinegar dressing and set in her own blue bowl, how they'd savor its brisk nip on their tongues, how they'd thank her and mingle their spirits with hers, and maybe a whiff of horseradish would rise from their table and reach her, even in faraway heaven. Cranes on the Platte at Sunset. This also was published in Plain Songs. And I wrote this actually about a picture that hangs in my office at work. Late evening, and the cranes take their act to the water. First 1 or 2 gingerly, a dozen, then 50 wade out to the sandbar, in water whirled blue at their stepping. Dusk builds them a dark blue fortress, tree mountains mound up before them, and the world and the water burn all to dark blue, and the birds one after another dark blue, and the sky blazing open behind them like a candle out of control, thrust live in a dark blue window. One more from my book. This one had not been published anywhere. before, and it's what I sort of imagined life might have been like before we had radios and TVs and so forth. But we did have wind in Nebraska. Their windows were glass bones dancing. They listened to wind at night instead of the radio. Wind heavy as wheat bundles bumping the kitchen door. Wind drawing its breath up the faded brick chimney, warming its lungs on strong lust of wood smoke. Wind flattening last summer's leaves crisp to the side of the house, taking old barn doors, slamming and slapping them, testing the weight of stodgy-grown haystacks. Only the windmill let the wind sing through its thin steel bones, never bending. Wind was their music, and their windows were glass bones dancing. Sometimes I like to use poetry to record a story or some interesting happening as a way almost of remembering the details. This first one of those that I'm going to read, I wrote in first person. It's not my story. I wrote it in first person only because it made it a stronger poem. It's written really for a cousin who, when he was a boy, young boy, came to our farm a lot of times during pheasant hunting season with his family. And he and I lost touch for many, many years until a couple of years ago our paths crossed and he told me this story and it was too good not to keep. The beginning of wisdom. It began in November, a half-day drive from the city. Hunting pheasants on land standing foreign and cold, dull, indeterminate gray except for a few brown things, the smooth rusted pump, a horse mulling over its hay. And I should put in here, he lived in Omaha, so the farm was a very new experience for him and something he enjoyed every time. At the pump, we passed around cupfuls of water. How I admired the men, their tireless talking. Whatever the subject, these uncles, so tall and all-knowing, knew the grain of it crossways and lengthwise. While I scratched circles of frost off the cold metal pipe with a fingernail until I could stand it no longer, sucked the tip of my finger warm in my mouth. That's when they said it, that your tongue would stick to cold metal. Then they walked off towards the orchard. As soon as I tried it, the pump began living, tightened itself like a snake to the skin of my tongue. All I could taste was a white, dry, granular burn, until nothing was gray and nothing was brown, and everything the world over clicked still like a picture, sharp, black and white. Actually, the Chaparral Poets in Lincoln. After I'd been writing about a year, I had an elderly friend who, I didn't know she knew I was writing, and suddenly she said one day she would like to see some of my poetry. So I took it over to her, and she said, well, wouldn't you like to belong to the poetry club? And I said, well, I didn't know there was one. So she had some connections. She did not belong herself, was not really a poet herself, but she knew 2 or 3 people that belonged to the Lincoln Chaparral Poets. And so that is how I became introduced to them, and they have just given me great encouragement. We're a club here in Lincoln. We meet once a month from September through June. We have an affiliated state organization called Nebraska Chaparral Poets, which includes some people from outstate who come in for retreats. We have a large, fun, informative, educational retreat each summer in August. There used to be a publication called Kitchen Clatter in Shenandoah, and they published several of mine. The Nebraska Health Department published a poem of mine because a friend liked it and took it over there, and it had to do with cigar smoke. And so they published that. Those, I think, were about my first things. I did have a poem published on the teenage page of the Nebraska Farmer back when I was 17. I'll never forget that one. A real story that a friend told me that happened to his father and his neighbor lady, their neighbor lady, back many years ago when he was farming with horses up in northern Nebraska. And the horses never skittered. She never spoke to him after that day in the garden, bending over, hoeing green beans, when a gust of wind whipped her hat off her head with her wig inside. Wheeled them over the fence right into the side of his disc. Rested them there at the side of his disc, nested together like hen with a chick, white straw hat and brown curled wig, fluttering there at the side of his disc, while he rested his team at the end of the row, and the horses never skittered. She never spoke to him, but threw the hoe down and ran to the house, head bare and bright as an onion set in the late spring sun. Delicately as he could, he picked the pair up, soft and foreign to his large, hard hands, and laid them over the fence by a rhubarb patch, figuring that was the least he could do. Then he got on his disc and he clucked to his team to go on. When he returned, he saw they were gone, whether to the wind or whether, once he had gone from sight, she had ventured forth to repair her plight. He never knew, but she never spoke to him again. This one is my own story of a very difficult night that I drove to my hometown, 120 miles northwest of here, in a snow and sleet storm. And the only reason I went was I had promised my mother, who was very, very ill, that I was coming. And I was coming early to miss the ice storm. And then a minute later, I went out to the car and the ice storm had started. And I didn't have the heart to disappoint her, so I made it through, but it was difficult. And when I came back, I told all my friends that nobody but a penguin should really have been out on the road that night, and I still believe that's true. White Night of the Penguins. White offers no shades of itself, no variations, muted to watered down hues. White is all white, snowed over this road, only a penguin knows. Here comes one now, his low beam meeting mine, in full control, sharp in his black tux, driving his wife to some dark dance, no doubt. These penguins know their way. That one passing now, his tires fishtail slightly, hurrying home from work to where his missus has his supper fixed. Soon he'll elevate his feet, loosen up his collar, let his flock of little penguins clamber on his lap. My windshield wipers never wipe away this white, this wicked blizzard web, the star that blinds me. Still I follow. Now another car comes on, its low beam almost lost until it catches mine. This penguin doesn't wave. He knows that I'm some foreigner, caught blind and grasping for familiar hills and curves. I wonder where he's going. Choir practice, maybe, a meeting of the Grange. These penguins little care if I can't see a hump, a lump, a tree, because this white is white and all. There a car goes sliding, squealing. Some teenage penguin, to be sure. It really isn't half that slick. Perhaps I've got the knack. Home at last, I step out in the snow, expect to see my old blue coat turn black and white, my feet gone webbed and waddling like penguin feet. There's a little boy that visits me at my office occasionally, and he's always been a favorite of mine. His name is Tommy. And he happened to be at my desk talking to me at a very strategic time a couple years ago, and it's something I guess he'll never forget. Tommy. Tommy thinks of dollars every time he sees me, remembering all those stacked 20s the boss tied up with red ribbon and tossed like a package of fish on my desk last Christmas. And the joy of the seeing and the joy and the pain of the wanting blazes blue in his bright candle eyes. 6 months later, he is back. How did you spend it? His eyes still surging with envy, his voice like a stone rolled off from a roof, splatting out, now it's gone? Someday he will tell the story to a dimpled and tow-headed grandson, and the candle blue flame in their eyes for a moment will catch and will hold as they savor the magic of the toys and the toys and the toys that a fair stack of 20s would buy. This one is a story my mother used to tell. When I was a child, she made sauerkraut, and she had a little wooden paddle that she tamped the jars of sauerkraut and the juice had run out. And I don't know much about making sauerkraut myself, but it seems you have to do that. She told the story of some people, some neighbors of hers that made sauerkraut when she was a child. Sauerkraut barefoot style. My mother, with a wooden paddle sousing juice from weeping jars of sauerkraut, recalled her childhood in the 20s, when the next-door neighbors, making kraut in tall stone vats, called the children, who in eager barefoot glory took turns stomping, tumbling, laughing, till the stuff was whipped to foam. Put the kraut up neat in jars, shared their bounty up and down the block. Her family emptied theirs, she said, down the outhouse hole, washed the jars, and waited a respectable amount of time before returning them with thanks. A great deal of tragedy swept my grandfather's, Dorf's, family back just at the beginning of the 1900s. He, my grandfather, and his two oldest daughters died of tuberculosis, I think within a little less than 3 years of one another. So I wrote this poem one time after visiting their graves, and it was actually was in a contest that was sponsored by Nostalgia magazine, and I won an honorable mention in it. To a grandfather I never knew. Today I touch this granite stone you lay beneath for more than 30 years before my birth. So little do I know of you, except that you were kind and loved your land and horses, God and family, fellow man. They say we all have faults. I don't know yours, and I am glad. I see you now upon this plot, heading up the little crowd, the day that you and Mary buried Nora. Ill yourself, your soul bent down inside itself with grief, yet standing stalwart, tall, your youngest son, an infant in your arms. He was my dad, you know. Before a year had passed, the little crowd returned and laid you here beside your firstborn Nora. And less than 2 years later, they laid young Lizzie with you. Your Mary sorrowed so, her spirit must have spun an iron cocoon to carry on. I wonder, as I touch your stone, if anyone has come and traced your granite name, or bowed his head or thought to care since I last came. The winds blow rigorous on this hill, the winter's cold, and yet you're not in pain. I'm glad this granite stone marks who you are and where, if only just for me to come and touch occasionally, remembering you and who I am and why. Again, in a little lighter vein and back to some nature, this was published in Plain Songs last winter of '94. This sidewalk runs along the edge of town, a gray and simple song that never sleeps, stands ready day and night to take the step of man or God or common toad. This sidewalk sees but just one block ahead and two behind, because a hill is here. And when it feels a need for beauty, lets a pansy plant slip through a crack and crown itself in bloom. Willows trail their feather boas here, summer doves walk in and out of spots of sun. Nighttime owls peer down its moon-washed sweep for little meals, and baby wrens learn cats can creep unseen. This sidewalk looks like polished pewter when it rains, as if somewhere beyond itself it sees the sun. Try to not get discouraged with rejection slips. We all get a lot of them, even after we've been published a lot. And it's, I'm one that did get discouraged, and as I said, I stopped writing for a while. But I think it's very important to just keep at it, and the more you write, probably the more you improve, that your chances may become better in being published in the future. Cattail thoughts. Cattails draw their thoughts up perpendicular, like ladies standing slim on stems, intoning prayers at dusk. When red-winged blackbird cuts away their sleep, and spears of daylight dance around their feet. Perhaps they peer about to see if, while they slept, a modern Levite woman hid her baby Moses in their midst. This is Choke Cherries, and it was published in Northeast, a poetry and literary magazine, in the summer of 1993. And when I think of choke cherries, I always think of poison ivy, because when we picked them on the farm, the two grew just like they loved each other. They were always side by side. Choke cherries burn red-black, sudden as pupils of a white owl staring out of the bushes, defiantly acid, tart as the wince of a pinched nerve, their shrubs nestled close among stinging nettles, sharing a sinister sisterhood with the poisonous ivy that brings up red welts all over the pickers. Even after they're tamed and turned into claret-red jelly in jars, the itches and scabs incurred in their picking remind that wild things will always want their own way. And I think I missed one that I meant to read in my book that had been published in another issue of Northeast. And it's called Shyness, and it's about country school life. I didn't read this before, did I? No one is shy anymore, not like then. And I believe that's so true. I believe it's very true, because I just don't see kids that are shy like I was and like some of the neighbor kids were that I grew up with. No one is shy anymore, not like then at the old country school, where even the grass in late February was afraid to turn all the way green, and the red-haired kids wouldn't talk for 2 years. The mouse tasted books only at night, afraid if it poked its nose from the chink chewed out of the mopboard back of the teacher's desk, somebody would scream it to death. Even the pages of history never asserted themselves nor their facts, and the maps coiled themselves tight on their spring rollers like window shades shy of the sun. This was published recently in the fall of 1994, just in the last month, in Plain Songs. And it's a poem I had a lot of fun with. It's kind of crazy, but they're kind of fun ones. And I picked it up on the phrase in the Bible that says that they hung their harps in the willows. So it's called Harps in the Willows. Down from the hills they come, bands of them running, haunted by horn of the unicorn shrilling, haunted and hurrying out of the mountains, fleeing, escaping, hauling their harps along, tripping and tumbling, tents folded, flapping, willful and wild they come, beating the timbrel drums, zithers and cymbals ring, rushing down to the rivers, urging their donkeys down into the Babylon, hanging their harps in the limbs of the willows, rushing onward without them down tail of the river, leaving their harps all alone in the willows, only the night breeze left now to play them, to finger the strings of the harps at the river, making them hum to the lilt of the ripples, running soft in the night down the Babylon River, sparkling light just enough for the moon to come bathing, like a wild thing washing itself in the river, where the harps sing alone in the limbs of the willows. Whole Notes is another publication that I've had several poems published in. Nancy Peters Hastings is a Nebraska lady, also a Nebraska native, and she lives in New Mexico now and is the editor of Whole Notes. A couple of years ago, I went on a Volkswalk through Wyuka Cemetery. So this is Wyuka in October. It's as if each tombstone stands taller today, ready to meet us eye to eye, proud of all that it stands for, of memories chiseled hard into it, names hammered to last over the centuries. One holding a photo already 100 years old, yet unfaded, We think of the storms his 4-year-old child has looked out on, cold winds working the sweet marble brow, crisp coatings of snow in her eyes, yet what pain can she bear now that death has already been born? Or her parents grieving their sweet morning glory, wrapping her under the soil, a mere bulb, to blossom again in an eternity too strange and too far to imagine, though it's now theirs as well. And the young flyer brought down from the sky, bedded forever beneath the propeller that failed him. His dreams and his visions live on in the sky, and at night, when a plane pulses its lonely red light overhead, this marker stands at attention. This is The Summer the Crows Cried My Name, and it was published in Plain Songs 2 in 1993. The crows cried it all over the sky before anyone else knew, something insistent like a scream rising out of the hot, scorched corn, headstrong as wind and resistant to reason. It was the summer the old bald-face succumbed to the heat, and the bay mare, taken into a fit, reared and fell through the tin granary and lay on her back, kicking to ribbons the tin all around her, while my mother, in cumbersome panic, ran half a mile to get help. There weren't many telephones then, buzzing subtle predictions of Johnny or Jack, but the crows seemed to know, seemed to sense even then my insistence on being myself, and they cried out my name all over the sky. I keep thinking that after I retire, that I'll have my new job ready made for me. I don't know that I would be a novelist, but I think I'd like to try when I had enough time. But I don't want to give up poetry. But poetry, right now, is the perfect medium, I think, for myself, because you work on it a line at a time. You work on it sometimes only one word at a time, trying to get that one word right, and trying to find the word that really fits and that really has the exact meaning that you want to convey for this goal of mine of wanting to be exact and to express myself in maybe a new and fresh way that somebody else hasn't said before. This is Harness Maker, 1946, and I never saw this man. I was never in his shop, and the only words I ever heard spoken about him are these, and I heard them frequently, it seemed, and they were, he isn't dead, but he is dead, but he hasn't fallen over yet. Harness Maker, 1946. He hasn't fallen over yet, but he is dead, Jake always said. His back was hunched, his body bulging out of faded overalls, legs like stovepipes, bent forever at the knees and bowed. His hair, perhaps once white, had yellowed like a clipping from a 1910 Tribune, and thin strands bridged the bare spots on his speckled scalp. His eyes were dry like creek beds, cracked and gray, staring always inward toward some drifting dream. He had a bulbous nose set like a handle on a bulldog's jowls, and hands as humped and brown as roasted hens, slowly cutting straps and fitting rivets into blackened harness horses wore. He hasn't fallen over yet, but he is dead, Jake always said. His soddy monotone came slow, in syllables that mingled with the brownness of the rough-cast walls, with dusty leather fittings, smells of oil and mice, paunchy collars sagged on hooks, their stuffing crumbling out like wilted popcorn, waiting for the mice to nibble in the night. Some tin tobacco boxes lined the cobwebbed windowsill, and gunny sacks half full of something slumped like errant winos on the floor beneath. He hasn't fallen over yet, but he is dead, Jake always said. Behind him slept old boxes of new hames and copper rivets, some half opened, some untouched forever on their shelves. Receipts were stored on rusty spindles, petal-eared. The drawer below, well-slivered, held a little change, a brown-stained china cup, a 5 or 2, a saucer full of rusty nails. Among the thickened shadows at the back lurked hulky forms. His soul, perhaps, in permanent eclipse. He hasn't fallen over yet, but he is dead, Jake always said. It was fun kind of trying to recreate him out of an imagination that never did see him anyway. Recently I wrote this one called Beekeeper, about a person who was a beekeeper back at my hometown. Spike whiskers stand like new lettuce on his chin, and he clasps it firm over the top of his shirt. His overalls hang like a Mother Hubbard on a bag full of beans. Slow he approaches the hives, lets the bees continue their work, flowing over around him. He takes in solely the sounds of the small bee motors, brush of silk wings, lets them empty himself of himself, sees something gold, something good in the life and the death of a million bees working alfalfa in shimmer of sun. And his face loosens, spreads to a smile easy as gold wax. This is to a grandmother I never knew. She died in childbirth when my mother was born. They spoke so gently of you, as if you'd tiptoed out the door to bring a kitten in out of the snow, and never did return. Were you a saint? They loved you so? I wonder why, just when the birds were singing in your soul, the light went out before you got to hold the baby that your frail form carried through the hopeful months to birth. A few things you have left behind: the white dress with embroidery that you made, a clump of chestnut hair in tissue wrapped away, and photographs record your charming, timid smile. But most of all, you left behind a baby girl, and she's my mother now. Incredible you had to give your precious life so we could live. Each time I think of you, I try to be more worthy in my soul. I hope there's something in me that's from you, some thread of gentleness, the tilting of your head. I'd like to think your eyes might sparkle sometimes in my thoughts and deeds, as candles in a mirror echo down the years. Thank you for a chance at living life. You must have loved it too. They spoke so gently of you. This one is Witch. At the time of the rain, you see her, face into the lightning outside her back door. Hair fluffed white like a thistle, wisping and working in whiffles of wind. You see lightning crack open her face like an egg, and thunder shake spectrals of bats out of low-hanging clouds, cobwebbing, clawing around her. The things that she told you that night on the sidewalk spill out of your memory, real and sudden as rain that drives you inside. From the doorway you watch her head tilt, and she howls like she told you, a slim line of sound straight into the wind like an old hound. Lightning writes golden flame codes on her earrings that you hope you can't read. This one is about a house that looks like a face, and its fictitious address is 216 Main. You could name this house Mildred and lose none of its charm. See her upright windows exclaiming beneath slanted eyebrows, how she scrooches her lips to a most prudent pose, and the thin brown hair of her roof parts and drapes as if fresh from a 20s salon. Her perfect complexion preserved but not jaundiced by siding that yellow. Buttons was a much-loved dog who I came to know almost in an unusual way. And 2 years later, his master died, and I was the one who inherited him, the neighbor that lived over the fence from him. And after he died, I wrote this lengthy poem, really for therapy. And then one of my friends suggested it should be published, so I went ahead and did that myself. He was a wonderful dog, but I didn't want to forget him nor a lot of the things that he did or how I acquired him. This one little part that I will read is one thing that always amused me that I saw him do, and I'm sure he was blushing under his beautiful collie shepherd fur. There used to be a mean old yellow cat that strayed around here. You saw him in our yard once, and you made after him like a lion rushing a kill. But he stood there unflinching, with no intention of shifting his course in the slightest, for a collie shepherd fire engine full speed. Still and unruffled he stood, that blue-eyed god of the grasses. You veered off slightly to miss him, wisely, and stopped short in the corner of the yard, where you stood with your face to the fence until you stopped blushing. Feels good to be a Nebraska author, and it's a goal, an aspiration that I've had for a long time, and one that I lost sight of, as I say, because of becoming discouraged. So it does feel good to be able to be published and to be accepted in the world as a Nebraska writer. Night rain in the forest rains all day. Its crystal shimmering spatter leaf to leaf, like ladies trying diamond earrings on, sparkling each a moment, tossing to the next, down stairs and stairs of storied green.